In this episode, I am rebroadcasting one of the most impactful episodes that I published in 2021. Are you ready to reimagine your life and career with Michael Clinton? Michael is the author of Roar, Into the Second Half of Your Life Before It's Too Late. It is really a great book, and if you listen to the original episode in August of 2021, then I want you to listen to it again. Especially take note of Michael's last couple of answers. Cue the music.
Welcome to the Repurpose Your Career podcast, brought to you by Career Pivot. This podcast is where those of us in the second half of life come together to discuss how to repurpose our careers for the 21st century. Come listen to career experts give you proven strategies. Listen to people like you tell their stories on how they repurpose their careers. And finally, get your questions answered. Your host, Mark Miller, has made 6 career pivots over the last 30 years. He understands this is not about jumping out of the frying pan into a fire, but rather to create a plan where you make clear, actionable steps or pivots to a better future career. Are you ready to repurpose your career?
Welcome to episode 283 of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. My name is Mark Miller, and I'll be your host every Monday for discussion on what it's like to repurpose your career. In this episode, I am rebroadcasting one of the most impactful episodes that I published in 2021. Are you ready to reimagine your life and career with Michael Clinton? Michael is the author of Roar, Into the Second Half of Your Life Before It's Too Late. It is a really great book. If you listened to the original episode in August of 2021, I want you to listen to it again. Especially take note of Michael's last couple of answers. Let me read you some of Michael's LinkedIn About section. He spent 40 plus years in the publishing business as a publisher, SVP, Executive VP, President and Publishing Director of Hearst Magazines. Highlights include being on the executive team to launch O, the Oprah Magazine, Food, Network and HGTV magazines, and acquiring such titles as Elle, Men's Health and Women's Health, among others. In 2020, transitioned out of the day-to-day to become a senior media advisor to the CEO of the Hearst Corporation. Aside from his publishing career, he has published 10 books, 8 photography, 2 memoirs, the Globetrotter Diaries after visiting 100 countries, and Tales from the Trails after running 7 marathons on 7 continents. Writer, photographer, runner, motivational speaker, in the fall of 2021 published a new book, Roar, Into the Second Half of Your Life Before It's Too Late. Now a bestseller heading into a 3rd printing. Join the Roar community on roarbymichaelclinton.com. I will be discussing with Michael the concepts and process presented in his book. Now, rather than a word from our sponsor, I have an announcement. I am currently running my annual survey. I would be honored if you take a moment to take this short survey about Career Pivot and this podcast. You can find a link in the show notes at careerpivot.com/episode-283 or in the description in the podcast app you are using. I have been blown away at the response to the survey, but I'm not closing the survey until the U.S. Labor Day, which is September 5th of 2022. Please take a moment and take the survey. Now, on to my discussion with Michael Clinton. I want you to pay particular attention to his response when I asked him what he wanted his readers to do after they completed his book. Welcome to the Repurpose Your Career podcast. I have the real joy of having Michael Clinton, who is the author of Roar, Into the Second Half of Life Before It's Too Late. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Mark. It's great to be here with you. Thank you so much for inviting me.
You have the concept of roar. What is roar?
ROAR is a simplified formula for how you can engage into a very dynamic second half. One of the things that I like to say is if you're 50 and healthy, you may live another 40 years. And so, you can have multiple careers and multiple lifestyles and, multiple relationships. But a lot of people get stuck in what was their parents' definition of 50 plus and sort of move into behavior that is, sort of just stagnant, and they get stuck. And so ROAR is a formula for a way to move you forward into a new kind of second half. I call them Reimagineers. I interviewed 40 people who have all done this. And so I wanted to simplify it. So ROAR is an acronym, as you know, and the R stands for reimagine yourself before others do it for you. And, what is your favorite future? Then live it. The O is own who you are, where you come from, all the baggage you've had up to this point, your numbers, your health numbers, your financial numbers, your strengths, your weaknesses. You got to go through the process of owning who you are. I like to say it's not a midlife crisis, it's a midlife awakening, because, at that point, you pretty much know a lot about yourself, having lived 45, 50 plus years. Act on what's next for you, which is the action plan. And there's a chapter called Life Layering, which is a formula that I've used for 30 years that I'm sharing with the readers. And then the R is reassess your relationships, because they're the ones who are going to sort of facilitate where you want to go and who you want to become. Your family, your friends, your community, all of the above. So I try to put it in a very concise, actionable form with a lot of practical advice as well.
Yeah, there's no question. I've been a professional career changer in my life. And very often we create a vision of ourselves that is based on what people told us we were supposed to do. Our parents told us what to do. It just, I know I had a major bicycle accident in 2002. I hit a car head on at 50 miles an hour and obviously lived.
Wow.
And that got me to realize, to reflect on, why am I doing what I'm doing? And I think this pandemic, this is a good timing for this book, because a lot of people, particularly in our age demographic, this is time for a reassessment.
I think, pre-pandemic, a lot of this was kind of brewing in a lot of people's minds. But I think the pandemic, put it on, super speed, and you put it on hyper speed, because all of a sudden, to your point, it wasn't sort of a cataclysmic event that you experienced, but it was an existential moment for many people. They didn't know what was going to happen to them. And I think people sort of took a pause and said, am I doing the thing that I want to do? Am I living with the person I want to live with? Am I living in the place I want to live in? And, you've heard about the big quit, and you've heard about, a lot of this, the early retirement, and a lot of people leaving cities to go to other places. I think that this, sort of lit a match for people to sort of say, I've got to now take an action plan and build out the next chapter. So for sure, the pandemic did it.
Yeah. I just had Chris Farrell, the personal finance, on, and I had him talking about the big quit. And he actually put it in a framework where it was a good thing, particularly for folks, I like to say people in the second half of life.
Yeah.
So let's talk about reimagining yourself. Tell me what you mean by that. How do you do that?
First of it is you've got to go through this brutal, sort of self-analysis of yourself. And, how many people do we know who have been in a career for 30 years and they're stale, they hate it, they want to get out? I'm going to put sort of financial needs aside for a moment. And they get sort of frozen as to what they want to do next. And the book is filled with a lot of examples of people who, went back to school in their 50s. And people say, well, I can't afford to go back to school. But the reality is there's a lot of money for people who are in their 50s or older. There's a lot of money through Pell Grants and federal grants, and certain states you can go to college for free if you're over 60. So there, you just have to kind of do your homework. Or someone who wants to take what was a hobby and start building it into a business and become an entrepreneur. The Kauffman Foundation in Kansas City, they do a lot of work in this space. And the largest cohort of entrepreneurs are people 55 to 64. And one of the things you know is that we're going to have the biggest generational transfer of wealth in the history of the world over the next 20 years. There's $61 trillion of assets and so forth that the boomers, I'll call them, are going to pass on to the next generation. So people have a lot of capacity. Not everyone, of course. I mean, there are a lot of people who have, live in an equitable world who don't have that financial foundation. But there are a lot of people in the professional class who have the money and have the ability to pivot. And I always say a lot of it is inertia. You just don't put in the time. Most of the people I interviewed for the book, I would say they put in a good 1 year plus to figure out how they want to reimagine and who they want to be. And, one great example was a 57-year-old woman who was an elementary school teacher who ended up becoming a stand-up comic. And she travels all over the Southeast, doing stand-up comedy, and she's known in comedy circles. And, she always knew her sense of humor was something she needed to bottle. And so it's finding your strength to figure out how you can reimagine yourself against your strength. One example.
Because I can certainly imagine. I mean, I know for myself, I turned myself into someone who I was not. And for me, it was, I became a geek that could speak. And the way it would turn out is I'd go, and I'd collapse.
Right.
And my back would go out. And by the time I hit my 50s, I like to say I was an actor. I was playing a role and I just couldn't stay in character.
Yeah. So many people say that, and they hit the wall. They hit the wall, and they know that there's a great story of a guy who was he always wanted to be involved in social work somehow. And this gets back to your earlier point. His father said when he was a young man that if you don't study business, I'm not going to pay for your college education. And so he studied business, and he got into the business world, and he rose the ranks, the executive ranks. And when he was 50, he sort of had a bit of a personal meltdown and decided to leave his job and take a 6-month trip. And he was in Peru doing the ayahuasca ceremony, and which you might be familiar with. And he was sitting on a rock, and he said he saw his 16-year-old self across the pond and said, "I'm so sorry that I abandoned you." And that sort of moment set him on a course to come back to the States and move into the social work space. And he's been doing that for, 5-6 years now. He said, "I almost depleted all my savings, but it doesn't matter. I'm loving it." So he kind of found his true self, refound his true self.
Your part 2, and this is a section I really resonated with, is own who you are. Why don't you tell us about what the heck you mean by that?
Yeah, well, part of it is, people are not true to themselves, and we do get sidetracked. And ultimately, we have to, I write my personal story in the book. I came from a very poor working class family where there was no education in our family history. And once upon a time, I was ashamed of that until I realized that it was actually a strength because of how I found my way to my own successful adult life. But it's shocking to me how many, and I'm going to generalize here and say men are more do this more than women. They don't know their basic numbers, their health numbers. They don't know their basic blood pressure, their heart rates. They have never had a colonoscopy. I mean, it's crazy. And so you have to own your health numbers and own your financial numbers, which are two sort of foundational things. And I also say you have to own your final number. I mean, we are all going to leave the earth. And so you got to what's the plan? Do you have your stuff in order, so to speak, so that you're leaving your spouse and your loved ones in the place where you want them to be? And I also talk about the SWOT analysis, which is a formula that for those people who are in business will know it. It's really not only identifying your strengths, but knowing what you're not good at and knowing what, you may think that you are, really good at something, but you really aren't. And so you have to kind of own that as well. So that's also my favorite part of the book, because I think it makes you go deep inside yourself and be honest with yourself. So yeah, I love that part too.
I like also the owning your wins, strengths, opportunity, success, but more importantly, owning your weaknesses and your failures, because we grew up in a generation where failure was not an option.
Exactly. Yeah. No. Yeah. I think every school should teach a course in failing, because I think failures, there's so many amazing inspirational stories of people who we know in well-known people and people in our own lives who have failed, and we have all failed, and that's just part of the human condition. But you're right, we're taught not to embrace it. We're taught to sort of wallow in it. And so I think that it's a great lesson. I spoke to a guy named Randy Boyd who was a very, very successful businessman, and he talked about how he failed in so many of his business ventures but that if he didn't keep going, it was the fuel that kept him moving. So failures, by the way, failures in professional life, personal life, relationships, all of those things, you learn from them, and it's a cliche, but you do have to embrace the lessons and move forward with them. So yeah, it's an important piece of. I always knew that I was not great at math. I can read a P&L and I know financials, but I'm really not was never basically good at math. So I had to surround myself with people who were better than me in that space, especially when I was running a big business. So where your weaknesses are and you shore them up.
Yeah. Yeah. It's this morning I was actually speaking to a group in Princeton obviously virtually. I like using a quote from my friend Diane Wingert, who's a entrepreneurial coach. You have to get started before you're ready, because if we wait until we're ready, we never get started.
It's a head game for sure. I'll use my favorite examples on that, and this is in the sport of running. I'm a marathon runner and I'm a distance runner, and people say to me, "Well, I would kind of like to start running. What do I do?" I say, "Well, first of all, you're almost there because you said you want to do it. But the first thing you got to do is take the first step. And when you take the first step, you take the second step, and you do one loop around the high school track. And before you know it, you're doing 3 loops. And before you know it, you're like this guy Fanja Singh, who ran his first marathon when he was 82. But so much of it is a head trip about because so many people think they want to do things and say they want to do things. I have a friend, she always talked about she wants to write a book. And 5 years in, I would be, "Have you started writing that book yet?" And she looked at me like, "What do you mean?" And I said, "Well, you're always talking about it. So you got to take the first step and do it, or else give it up." And it sounds like good cocktail chatter, but, it's not something that's going to happen in a nice way. I say it.
Well, but it's very true. We say, "Oh, well, we're going to do certain things," and I'm a former marathon runner. I gave up marathoning because of my back.
Yeah,
and took up cycling.
So great sport.
Yeah. Well, I just did a 2,500 foot climb a week ago, and I'm about to do it again on Sunday.
You're definitely a reimagineer. You're definitely a roar person.
So the third part is act on what's next for you. Tell us about what you mean by that.
So one of the things that I love is this concept called life layering, which I referenced. And when I was just hitting 40, I thought to myself, I'm the most boring human being that I knew, because all I was doing was working. And I had a great job and great success. I was at the time the publisher of GQ magazine, which was a great seat to sit in. But all I was doing was working. And so I made a decision that I've got an adventure streak in me. So I decided I was going to try 3 things: climb Mount Kilimanjaro, take a flying lesson, and go to the race car driving school. And I ended up becoming a pilot and, hiking and climbing many mountains. But I made this sort of proclamation to myself and my family that my 40s were going to be my adventure years. And I started doing a lot of various adventurous things. And that was a layer on top of my career and my work. And then when I was in my 50s, they became what I call my creative years, photography and writing and so forth. And that was another layer on top of the adventure and on top of the career. So as you add a layer onto your life and you stay with it, you end up having a very rich experience in your own life, because you're creating an action plan that is consistent and persistent. And one of the things that I like to do, and it's a great way of keeping myself honest to myself, is I write out a journal every year. And so if I say in January, this is the year I'm going to learn Spanish, and I get to July and I haven't taken one Spanish lesson, then I know I'm really kidding myself. And so I'm not acting on something that I said I wanted to do. And so I check in on that journal in the beginning of the month to see what my progress is on a lot of fronts. And, action is the key, because, you have to get out of your own head of talking to yourself and saying, what have I done in the real world in terms of action? So the life layering is something that I think a lot of the readers will enjoy hearing about.
Quick interruption. If you are enjoying this podcast, please rate it and review it on whatever podcast player you are using. And more importantly, would you mind telling a friend? Thanks, and back to the podcast episode. One of the things when I read that section I thought of is I had Diane Wu David, who wrote the book Future Proof. And she talked about experimenting in your career, and that is doing low risk projects to see whether you actually even like doing it.
It's a great example. I think, I grew up in the print world, in the print world of magazines, but of course the digital disruption happened, and there were people who just refused to move into the digital space, which they got sort of chewed up and spit out, and they were out of the industry. And, you have to sort of, if you're in a business or a company or an industry that is being disrupted, you have to learn how to ride the waves of that disruption. It could be a mini wave, to your point, and you get involved in some projects, or you can just ride the big wave. But in my world, the only people who really continued to flourish were those who sort of embraced the digital disruption, and they were able to excel and succeed into the future.
Yeah, it's in today's world where there is so much disruption, particularly caused by the pandemic, that if you don't start experimenting or, start, as you say, layering on, you will be left behind.
Yeah.
And the world has changed, and there's so many things that, you can at least go try.
Right.
At very low risk, at very low cost, and go try it.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you a great example. Just in I was just having this discussion recently where someone said, I'm a photographer and I only shoot with film because that's what I kind of grew up with. And, I made the pivot into shooting all things digital. And when you learn digital photography, it's remarkable. First of all, you save a lot of money. Because you're not developing hundreds and hundreds, thousands of pictures that are on the cutting room floor. But what is amazing is that you learn technology, you learn, working with, different software suites, you learn how you can, edit and delete. It's a whole new exciting aspect of photography. But some people are afraid to take that first tiny step to say, okay, let me see what this is all about. But yeah, you got to do it.
So in the last section, which again, this resonated with me, is reassess your relationships. Why don't you tell us about that?
Well, it always starts with yourself, right? And, I'll get back to, the word retire is such a toxic word because, it makes your skin crawl, right? So I like to call it rewire. So think about when you're going out of your first career or your most recent career, how do you rewire for a next act? So one of the things I just did, Mark, which was a whole big interesting experience, was I went back to school in my 60s and I got a master's degree at Columbia in nonprofit philanthropy because I wanted to learn more about that sector. And I had to sort of have this conversation with myself about, do I really want to be writing papers and taking tests, with people who are half my age? But if you're a lifelong learner and you know that about yourself, that is reassessing who you are as an individual. And that some people don't like school, but I happen to like school very much. So, and also around you are family and friends who, some people have friends that they've had for 30, 40 years. And I'm in the publishing industry, so I believe in editing. And sometimes you have to edit people out of your life because you have, they're a negative influence, or they're holding back your own aspirations, or you have to reassess relationships with family members, which is always hard. But you have to get a very clear sense as to where you want to go and then propel forward. And that also happens obviously in work and in the community at large as well. But there's one of the great books that I've always enjoyed reading was, the title's a little somber. It's called The 5 Regrets of the Dying. And it was written by a hospice nurse who listened to everybody's story. And the number one thing that always came out of all the conversations at end of life was, I wish I had been more true to myself. I wish I had done the things that I really said I wanted to do. I kept putting them off. I kept listening to my husband, my wife, as you said earlier, my parents, my children. And it's too bad because I didn't get to live many of the things that I wanted to do and live. And I think that's a great life lesson.
Yeah, I have one of my favorite books is Necessary Endings by Dr. Henry Cloud.
I know it. Yeah.
And I read that several years ago. And of course, the philosophy is, in order for new things to begin, old things need to end. And
right.
By the way, most of us suck at ending things, whether they're relationships, careers. And for me, it was one of the things about, I'd lived in Austin, Texas for many, many 35, eventually 40 years. And I said, why am I still here?
Right.
My job doesn't require me to be here.
Right.
It gotten very expensive. It was not the funky place I moved to in the 70s. So why am I still here? And it's inertia. Yeah.
Yeah. But see, you went through what is such an important enlightening process, and many don't. When I said I'm ready to step out of the seat that I was sitting in, which was, I had a phenomenal seat as the president and publishing director of the largest magazine company, Hearst Magazines, and 42 years in. And when I announced that I was going to step out of that day-to-day seat, everyone's like, "Oh my God, you're going to miss it. You're like, aren't you going to be like, what are you going to do? What are you going to do?" And I think we all have to know that in business anyway, in careers, we sit in a seat that ultimately that seat has to change and has to shift. And if you take yourself out of the seat, that's really a big, courageous move. And because if you're going to take yourself out of the seat, you better have a self-identity as to who you are when you're not in that seat. And so that prep work is really important, especially for people, who have very powerful seats that they sit in. And you know the old adage, when, you step out of that seat and no one ever returns your phone call. So you better know who you are and what you want to do and be in your next phase. And so I'm completely with you in that understanding that.
I've been very fortunate. I've been, at least the idea is I'd rather be lucky than good, but I have always managed in my career to always move before bad stuff happened. So I was only laid off once, and I volunteered for that layoff. Every other move has been my choice. And a number of times when I realized this was a bad fit, or this is not. I've been through 2 successful tech startups, and that were acquired, and things turned.
Yeah.
And rather than waiting, I said, "This is it. Time to move on."
Yeah. No, it takes guts and courage and self-awareness. For people, there's a great story of a woman who I interviewed who was a journalist at a newspaper, and she obviously what's going on in the newspaper world. It's not pretty scenario in terms of the business is shifting dramatically, and she stepped out and went back to school again, another one who was in her 50s and became a psychologist. And she now works in the opioid crisis world, which is a completely different world. But yeah, you have to be, you have to have that. This gets back to the first R of roar. You have to reimagine yourself before others do it to you, or others do it at you or for you, or, all of the above. And so you have to have that constant sense of motion moving forward. And it's getting back to this point that we're all going to live a lot longer. And, we're going to be, having a lot more opportunities. Everyone has a chance. If you're 50 plus and healthy now, you have a chance to live a different life, a new life, one that you've been sort of yearning for. It's there.
Yeah. And I've had Andrew Scott on the podcast who wrote the book, The 100-Year Life.
Oh, that's a great book.
And the fact is, for many of us, we are going to live a whole lot longer. And I had him discuss, he wrote an article for Next Avenue talking about the fact that a 75-year-old today has the mortality rate of a 65-year-old 20 years ago.
Right.
So you've been given 10 more years.
Right.
What the heck are you going to do with it?
Right. Yeah, no, it's a great point, because I think you can have a third career, at that point. And once again, it's not going to be the same your original career, but it doesn't matter. What you're going to have is an experience that you're going to contribute to something. I love at that stage in your life, you may want to contribute a lot of your time into public service, social service, nonprofits that are also going through a whole world of disruption. And, with your experience, you can bring a lot of incredible, knowledge and wisdom to those worlds. Or you can start a for-profit business. You can start another startup in the tech space. I mean, it's all, it's all there. But people put self-imposed, I like to call it self-imposed ageism, because they say, well, I can't do that because I'm 70, or I can't do that because I'm 60 or 75. I had a guy once who I know who is 82 and asked me if I would look at his resume. I was like, yeah, sure. Ed, let me look at it. Tell me what you're thinking. And he goes, well, he's always had a business of selling. He and his wife have an art gallery, but he always had a side business of selling estate jewelry. And he said, I sell really, expensive pieces of jewelry. And I think I could go and sell airplanes, or I could go and sell, yachts. And I love the fact that he was 82 and he was thinking that might be something he'd want to do next. And so, I think the re-engineering of how people are thinking, there's going to be a lot of it in the next years to come.
So when someone finishes the book, what do you want people to get out of this book?
This may sound a bit radical. I want them to blow up some part of their life, because they're probably, if you have an inherent interest in the subject, you're probably, thinking about something that isn't working in your life. It might be work, it might be a relationship, it might be whatever it is. And, I like to say, you don't have to do it all at once. Pick something and commit yourself to it and start making that change. It might be something as basic as, getting back in shape and losing 50 pounds, whatever it is. But being inspired by the stories, being stimulated by the resources and the practical advice, using it as a tool for you to be able to keep yourself on a path to completely change something that you want to change. And it's hard, change is hard, but it's very doable, and it's very much something that can happen if you follow a lot of the examples that are in the book.
So, Michael, this has been great. If someone wanted to reach out and touch you virtually, we have to, we're still in a pandemic and we still have to have social distancing. So, and they wanted your book, how might they do that?
Well, thank you for asking that question. There's an author's website called roarbymichaelclinton.com. And it is, you can not only pre-order the book, but you can join in on a virtual book event on September 15th. You can sign up for a newsletter. There's a whole host of things you can do. So that's probably the most efficient way. And then, of course, I'm like many on LinkedIn and Twitter and, Facebook, Roar Michael Clinton. So, but I think it's the author's website, which is probably the best.
And we will put a link to that in the show notes.
Thank you very much.
So, Michael, thank you very much for being on the Repurpose Your Career podcast.
Fantastic. I love the conversation. Thank you so much for having me.
Michael was a lot of fun working on this episode. The book is full of useful stories that reinforce the concepts in the Roar process. What do you think of Michael's response when I asked him what he wanted his readers to do after they completed the book? Also, make sure and take this year's Career Pivot and Repurpose Your Career podcast survey. I am keeping the survey open until Labor Day of 2022. Take a moment, go to careerpivot.com, sign up for the weekly Career Pivot Insights newsletter, which is sent out every Sunday. You'll get a weekly update on this podcast, white papers, and new blog posts. I just published my latest white paper, Ageism, the Last Acceptable Bias. If you subscribe to the newsletter, you've already had an opportunity to download it. While there, do not forget to check out the Career Pivot community, which can be found at careerpivot.com/community. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Look for Career Pivot on Facebook and LinkedIn. You'll also find me on Twitter at Career Pivot. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. You will find all the show notes at careerpivot.com/episode-283. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Podbeam, Overcast, Spotify, Pandora, Amazon Music, and lots of other places where podcasts can be found. In fact, this podcast can be found on the Repurpose Your Career podcast channel on YouTube. Hope to see you next Monday for another episode of Repurpose Your Career podcast.